Think about the last time you considered quitting your job. Not the fantasy of it, the actual logistics, the real calculation. You ran the numbers probably. Mortgage or rent, health insurance, the 401k match you'd stop receiving, the vesting schedule you haven't hit yet, the lifestyle that's quietly become load-bearing, the subscriptions, the payments, the commitments that require next month's salary to exist. And somewhere in that calculation, a feeling emerged. Not a thought, exactly, more like a pressure. The sense that leaving wasn't just risky, it was structurally impossible. That too many systems depended on you staying. Most people call that feeling responsibility. Some call it adulting. A few just call it life. But that feeling has a history. A very specific, very deliberate history. And it didn't begin with you. In the 1880s, across the coal regions of Pennsylvania, the steel corridors of West Virginia, and the mill towns of New England, a new kind of community was being built. Not by governments, not by civic planners, by companies. They were called company towns. And they were, in a narrow technical sense, complete societies. You could be born in a company hospital, grow up in a company house, attend a company school, buy your food from a company store, and be buried, eventually, in a company cemetery. The entire architecture of a human life was provided by a single employer. The most famous was perhaps Pullman, Illinois. Built in the 1880s by George Pullman, the railroad car manufacturer, it was designed to be a model town. Clean, orderly, beautiful even, by the standards of industrial America. Workers had access to parks, libraries, a church. They lived in well-maintained row houses on paved streets. But nothing was owned by the people who lived there. Everything was rented from Pullman, purchased from Pullman stores. The wages came from Pullman. The housing costs went back to Pullman. The town itself functioned as a closed economic loop, and the people living inside it had almost no exit. The mechanism keeping them there wasn't a wall. It was arithmetic. The specific tool that made company towns work, economically, psychologically, was something called scrip. Company-issued currency. Money that looked like money, functioned like money in a narrow sense, but could only be spent in one place, the company store. Workers often received a portion of their wages in scrip, which meant a portion of their economic life was, by design, conducted entirely within their employer's ecosystem. You couldn't spend scrip at a competitor's store. You couldn't save it in an independent bank. You couldn't use it to leave. It was a currency with walls. And the company store, as a result, could charge whatever it wanted. There was no competition. Workers had no alternative. The famous folk song captured it plainly. I owe my soul to the company store. It's easy looking back to see the extraction, the cynicism of the design. Workers were not prisoners in any legal sense. They could theoretically leave, but leaving meant abandoning their housing, their credit at the store, the community their families had built, the only economic system they knew how to navigate. The costs of exit were calibrated to exceed the costs of staying. That is not a cage. It's something more sophisticated than a cage. It's a structure where the rational choice at every individual decision point is to remain. Now consider something. Scrip is gone. Company towns, in the industrial sense, are largely gone. The legal structures that enabled them were systematically dismantled through labor legislation, unionization, and the slow expansion of economic alternatives. By the mid-20th century, the American worker had access to something the Pullman employee did not: genuine optionality. And yet, consider the modern loyalty ecosystem. The airline miles that can only be redeemed on one carrier. The App Store credits that exist only within Apple's economy. The Amazon points, the employer stock grants, the company-matched retirement contributions that vest on a schedule designed to delay your departure. Consider how many digital subscriptions now bundle into a single platform's ecosystem. How leaving Netflix doesn't just mean losing Netflix, but losing a curated watch history, a recommendation algorithm, a behavioral profile that has learned what you like. The friction of leaving is engineered into the experience. These are not scrip. The comparison is imperfect, and honesty demands we say so. You can leave Netflix. You can cash out miles. The walls are permeable in ways they were not in 1885, but there's something worth sitting with here. The underlying principle, creating value that only functions inside your ecosystem, did not disappear with the company store. It became software. It became UX design. It became the default subscription that is slightly too annoying to cancel. The harder parallel is not the economic one. It's the psychological one. In the early 20th century, a Harvard-trained psychologist named Elton Mayo ran a series of experiments at the Hawthorne Works manufacturing plant in Illinois. He was trying to understand what made workers productive. What he discovered, somewhat unexpectedly, was that people responded less to physical conditions than to the experience of being seen, of belonging, of existing within a community that recognized them. Human beings, it turned out, didn't just need wages. They needed identity. They needed a sense of place within a structure larger than themselves. The great corporations of the 20th century understood this, consciously or not. The im of the post-war era. The Japanese zaibatsu. The lifetime employment culture of mid-century America. These systems offered more than salary. They offered a social world, a professional identity, a narrative of belonging that extended through decades, through communities, through retirement dinners and company anniversaries, and a photograph on the wall of a man who gave 40 years to the same organization. That is not exploitation in a simple sense. Those were genuinely good lives for many people. The stability of long-term employment created the American middle class. It funded education, home ownership, retirement security. The dependent relationship produced real value for the people inside it. But it also created something else, a kind of structural identity, where who you are becomes inseparable from where you work, where your social network exists largely within your employer's orbit, where your health, your retirement, your sense of professional selfhood all run through the same institution. And when that institution restructures or downsizes or simply changes its culture, the loss isn't just financial. It's ontological. People don't just lose income. They lose themselves. This is the ladder most of us climb without fully seeing it. It begins simply. A salary. Consistent income, replacing the uncertainty of freelance work or entrepreneurship. That's not a trap. That's a rational choice. Stability has genuine value. But stability generates commitments. A salary makes a mortgage possible. A mortgage makes a neighborhood possible. A neighborhood generates a school, a community, a set of expectations about how life should look. Healthcare, in the American system particularly, becomes tied to continued employment. Retirement savings accumulate inside employer-sponsored plans, growing steadily, vesting gradually, in accounts that function best if you remain exactly where you are. Each step is rational. Each step makes sense given the one before it. And together, they build something that wasn't planned. A structure where leaving has become genuinely expensive. Not impossible. Not illegal. Just expensive in ways that make staying feel like the only reasonable choice. The company town didn't disappear. It graduated into something subtler. The geography shrank to a psychological space. The company store became the financial infrastructure of a salaried life. The script became the sum of all the systems that only work if your employment continues. And here is where intellectual honesty matters most, because none of this is simply sinister. The systems that create dependency, also create security. The mortgage that locks you in place also builds equity. The employer-sponsored retirement plan that makes leaving costly also compounds over decades into something that might actually be enough. Healthcare tied to employment is a dysfunction of American policy, not a corporate conspiracy. And in countries with universal coverage, it doesn't bind people the same way. Corporate campuses with their free meals and on-site gyms and dry cleaning services are not prisons. They're conveniences that some people genuinely appreciate. The fact that they also reduce friction around spending time at work, that they blur the boundary between the job and the life, doesn't mean everyone inside them is being exploited. Many of those people are doing meaningful work, being fairly compensated, and living lives they have actively chosen. The question the history raises is not, is your employer evil? It's more uncomfortable than that. It's how much of your life depends on one system continuing exactly as it is, because that is the real lesson of Pullman, Illinois. Not that George Pullman was a villain, though he had his moments, but that a structure can be genuinely beneficial to many of the people inside it and still, simultaneously, be difficult to exit. Those two things are not opposites. Dependency and benefit can coexist in the same system. That's precisely what makes the structure stable. In 1894, the workers of Pullman finally did go on strike. What triggered it was an abstract principle. It was a wage cut during an economic depression, while Pullman simultaneously maintained rent levels at its company-owned housing. The math had simply become undeniable. The strike was eventually broken by federal troops. Eugene Debs, who organized it, went to prison. George Pullman died a few years later, reportedly so despised by his own workers that his family buried him in a lead-lined coffin encased in concrete, fearing the body would be exhumed and desecrated. The history of these systems does not end cleanly. It doesn't offer simple morals. What it offers is a pattern, a recurring human tendency to build structures that work, that provide genuine value, and that also, quietly, accumulate dependency in ways that become visible only when something breaks. Freedom, in this context, is not an ideology. It's not a political position. It's closer to a structural question. How many of your most important needs, health, shelter, retirement, professional identity, daily schedule, social community, run through the same single point? If that point were removed tomorrow, not through choice, but through circumstance, how much of your life would remain intact? The company towns of the 1880s were visible. You could look around and see that every building was owned by one entity, that every dollar circulated within one system. The dependency was architectural, legible. The modern version is less visible because it's distributed across a dozen different systems that each feel independent. Your employer, your mortgage lender, your insurance provider, your retirement platform, but that all, in practice, require the same thing, that you continue without pause inside the structure you're already inside. Nobody designed it this way. No one sat in a room and planned the psychological architecture of modern economic dependency. It emerged from rational decisions made at every level that happened to produce something structurally familiar. The workers of Pullman would recognize the shape of it, even if they wouldn't recognize the form. What you do with that recognition is genuinely your own.